So, what narcissistic trait do you most identify with? So, one of the very common questions I hear is, am I the narcissistic one? I don't know if you are, unless I had more information. But more and more people are grappling with this question. There are a few different things that could be true. First, you may have been told by someone else that you are narcissistic and believe them. Second, you recognize that you have one of the traits. For example, you may cop to the idea that you are sort of superficial and it matters to you how things look. And you care about that deeply and you're kind of judgy if they don't look good or a person doesn't look good, right? And finally, it could actually be because you are actually narcissistic and are seeing it clearly. Now, this is the least likely scenario, but it's possible. And if so, good. And the hard work of therapy and all the rest of it could ultimately be a good thing for you because you're willing to make that painful admission and it's kind of true of you. But for those of us who have been through narcissistic relationships, the great fear is, what if it is me? What if I'm complaining about them, but actually it's me? And then this takes us to that complicated conversation about this idea of so-called healthy narcissism. And you know I do not love that term. I understand why people use it or say it, but there's really no version of low empathy, selfishness, entitlement, and excessive needs for praise and grandiosity and envy and arrogance and taking advantage of other people that's ever going to be healthy. I think there's healthy ego. There's certainly healthy assertiveness. There are healthy boundaries. But that stuff is not narcissistic. And that takes us back to this video. Something that we all grapple with is that there are parts, strands, pieces of the narcissism trait list that we pretty clearly and honestly identify in ourselves. And if we have suffered in a narcissistic relationship, that idea that one of these things is true of us can feel terrifying. For example, you may identify with having less empathy after spending years in a narcissistic relationship or growing up in a narcissistic household. It's a sort of compassion fatigue that leaves you concerned that you're losing or have lost your empathy. You may identify with some of the entitlement that you are the person who will point out an inefficiency, or maybe one day had it on a long travel day, and on the fifth delay, you find yourself raising your voice with a person in an airport or with a customer service representative after you're transferred for the 10th time and you demand to speak to their supervisor. You may wonder if it's grandiosity when you are talking about your hopes for your new business, or maybe you're just a dreamer. You may actually resonate with the selfishness piece and recognize that you're a creature of habit that needs things the way that you need them, and that it may not always work for other people, but you're not going to change it. Some of us may identify with the envy or jealousy piece and may wonder that when we covet someone's vacation or lifestyle or Instagram posts, or even just what seems like their healthier, happier marriage or family, that maybe we're just an envious person. Some of you may find that you're a bit more vindictive than you like, saying like, ooh, I am going to make that person pay for that, and may feel that revenge fantasy thing kind of happening for you. And some of you may say, ugh, that whole self-righteous narcissism thing. I am a workaholic and I work all the time and I kind of do judge people who seem kind of lazy to me because they only work 40 hours a week. What does that mean to me? Or some of you may really want to do good things in the world and are involved in volunteering and charity, and you share that with the world because you want people to support those causes. And you pick out that one strand that may be something about you or something you have done once, and you open your eyes widely and say, ugh, oh gosh, that's me. I have to own that. And that's what makes this conversation messy. There is that element of the narcissistic personality that we may actually identify with. We also may not like it, or we may accept it as an unpleasant part of ourselves. But the key is to remember that one element does not a personality make. You need all the pieces and the consistency and the lack of self-reflective capacity, because you may have the entitled moment and then apologize and then not do it again, or at least not do it again for a very long time. You may have a lack of empathy just because you're burned out empathy, but you see it within a context. And again, you take accountability for it, and you try to address your behavior, and you recognize that you don't lack empathy. It's a dip in your empathy. You may have the big dreams, but you regulate yourself emotionally when things don't always work out the way you want. There is a danger in making this complicated conversation simple. We human beings are very complicated. And so let's flip the script for a little bit. When we look at the components and the strands that make up, for example, agreeableness, which is really sort of the opposite or counterweight to antagonism, which in antagonism is kind of all the overarching stuff of narcissism. Agreeableness is made up of humility, modesty, empathy, being a clear communicator and a direct communicator, being altruistic, and being trusting, and seeing other people as being well-intentioned, okay? The challenge is that on some days, the narcissistic person may do something nice for someone or be a clear communicator. But a narcissistic person will almost never have all of that stuff together happening on many, many, many days in succession. But there are likely to be aspects of narcissism that we all identify with, and it's not easy. Because when we see that in ourselves, we may get unsettled or think that maybe we are the problem, or go all the way in and believe that we are the narcissistic ones. Slow down. Frankly, the stuff that comprises narcissism, some of it sadly, is needed to get stuff done. For example, some of that entitlement can mean that you do actually persist and get your question answered and not stay on hold all day. Or that burnt out empathy doesn't mean that you lack empathy, but it doesn't mean that you're just sort of putting out there for everyone and not taking care of yourself. Are there narcissistic folks out there who have some self-awareness and that are aware that they have this pattern and it doesn't always work? Yeah, there are self-aware narcissistic people. And that doesn't mean necessarily that it'll change substantially or get better, but they may be more willing to cop to their BS. And if you are in a relationship with them or a friendship with them or as part of their family or you work with them, they are definitely not people you are going to go to when you're struggling, for example, with an emotional issue or you need empathy or support or a sympathetic ear. But the more self-aware of the narcissistic person, perhaps the less likely it is that they'll gaslight you or come out and say, listen, I'm not good with this emotional stuff. And then they'll shrug and then they'll walk away. But don't get too lost in believing that having a bad day or experiencing burnout or even a little bit of selfishness makes you narcissistic. And ultimately, the reason narcissism is harmful, frankly, it's not the individual traits per se. I'd argue it's the lack of self-awareness, the blame shifting, the selling the message that they're there for you when they aren't. It's the confusion and the lack of insight. That's the stuff that hurts us. Most of us could navigate a lot of these individual traits. Maybe not the lack of empathy as much or the low empathy as much, but all the others, yeah. But we could certainly just roll our eyes at the excessive need for praise or the big grandiose talk. It's complicated. And the narcissistic stance of needing to always protect themselves and their fragile ego, the shame, that's what results in the behaviors that are so harmful. So you can't be selfish all the time. But before you write yourself off for having some selfishness, remember that all of this is nuanced and that all of us could benefit from more self-awareness. And personally, I'm owning it. I tend to hold a grudge. Something that we do see in narcissistic folks, that vindictiveness, maybe not vindictiveness, but certainly that stewing in it. I know it's not my favorite part of me, but it is a part of me. I'd like to think I have the other stuff in check, but we all got something. And maybe these little strands of narcissism that we have in us is what fuels our rationalizations in our narcissistic relationships that we have in adulthood too. But if someone called me out on my grudge holding, I'd cop to it in a minute. And the ownership of it and the awareness that we have of our little narcissistic strands, that's often all of the difference. Thanks again.